Okay, well, I'm going to get started. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Fueling Your Best Self, Fostering a Positive Relationship for Food and Body. I'm Maureen Naziel, and I'm the Education and Program Manager for New Canaan Cares. CARES' mission is to empower youth, strengthen family, and build community. And we are also the local prevention council for New Canaan, which means we provide drug and alcohol prevention programs. So today I'm happy to welcome Dr. Melissa Coffin. Melissa is a licensed psychologist in Connecticut and is a certified eating disorder specialist supervisor with over 15 years of experience providing services to adults and adolescents. Dr. Coffin works with a variety of presenting concerns, including women's issues, life, life transitions, depression, anxiety, and trauma. And in addition, she specializes in eating disorder, treatment of eating disorders. Dr. Coffin received her bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and master's and doctoral degrees in counseling from the University of Southern California. And she believes that counseling should be individualized to your needs, and her approach is genuine, thorough, and compassionate. I've gotten to know Melissa as she is a New Canaan Cares board member. We're so lucky to have her as a voice and as part of New Canaan Cares. So thank you for joining us today. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to talk with you all today. We are going to save some time at the end for questions. So take note as we go. If there's something you have a question about, I want to try to make sure to address that and get to that. But again, thank you for joining us. I think the hope today is we can just do a little overview about eating disorders and body image. We can flip to the next slide if you want. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk again about body image, eating disorders, some of the underlying components to that, what contribute, what to do if you are worried about somebody, and then how to try to increase positivity and healthy conversation and ideas in your household. You can see there we've got Inigo Montoya talking to Wesley there saying, nope, there is too much. Let me sum up. And that is kind of how I feel about this topic. This is the focus of my career. I'm really passionate about eating disorders and recovery. And so I could talk about this all day, but we'll try to really limit myself to our time. So let's go to the next slide and start with the concept of body image. This is a term that gets thrown out quite a bit. And I find sometimes that people aren't quite sure what it means. And so I think it's helpful to have an understanding of what is body image. It's a combination of both thoughts, feelings that you have about your body, and how you perceive yourself when you look in the mirror. So I think the interesting thing about that is that it is not necessarily accurate, as you can see from this. What we see in the mirror in terms of body image may not actually be what those who love us and surround us perceive. And so, what we can see sometimes in a situation like this is that body dissatisfaction, even body dysmorphia, can occur when there's a conflict with maybe an idealized body image that somebody might have, and then their perceived physical, personal appearance. I think it's also important to acknowledge that when we're talking about body image and promoting healthy body image or positive body image, that body image is not static. It is something that is always changing. It is variable. It can change based on who you are surrounding yourself with. It can change based on your mood. It can change based on the lighting in a dressing room. And so our goal is not to have somebody feel positive and amazing in their body all day, every day. I think that would be unrealistic. But what we're aiming for is that more often than not, we are hoping that somebody can feel pretty good about themselves and pretty good in their body as they're navigating the world. So that's what we're going for with this. Let's do next slide. Um, I think this next one, Maureen, if, yeah, there we go. This one is a really interesting slide that I just wanted to share when we're thinking about what impacts how we feel about our bodies. So it breaks it down by gender. This is a couple years old now. It's something from something called the Florida House Study. They interviewed about 1,000 folks to try to understand what impacts how we feel about our bodies. And what I think is interesting to highlight there is if you look at for women, social media and TV movies make up almost 43% of how they feel about their bodies versus 25% if we look at for men. So I don't think this is a shock to you of just recognizing how powerful social media and TV and movies can be in terms of how we feel about ourselves. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of unpack that idea a little bit more here. So what we know in the advent of social media is, of course, we know that it impacts how we feel about ourselves. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that, back in the day when social media started, right? I'm sure a lot of you remember with me that it started in more text-based social media. So the advent of Twitter and even early days on Facebook was a little bit more about text and sharing updates in that way. What we saw is that when social media went more image based with the advent of Instagram, Facebook becoming more picture based, now Snapchat and YouTube, there's a lot more content that is revolving around pictures and videos. And unfortunately, we have seen higher rates of disordered eating, weight and shape concerns, and increased anxiety associated with consuming a lot of social media. So the challenge with that and what we believe is happening here is that we are making comparisons on social media, oftentimes largely with peers, with friends, with family, with people in our community. And unfortunately, the research shows that when we're comparing with peers, at times that can be incredibly impactful. They did a really interesting study years ago where they showed people pictures of women's bodies in bikinis. And then they had the faces of the women covered up in the first group that they were studying. So just they showed pictures of women in bikinis and they had the participants rate how those pictures impacted how they felt about themselves. And then in the second group, they showed the same picture of women in bikinis, but they showed their faces, and the women were supermodels. And so, what was interesting is that they found that when the participants saw that the pictures of the women were supermodels, they actually felt better about themselves because they realized, like, oh, well, that's a supermodel. And that is not someone really to compare myself with. That is somebody that's their total job. And I thought that was a really interesting result, right? So we can see that if you are looking at social media and you're seeing a picture of a supermodel, you might feel one way. But if you're seeing a picture of your neighbor on the beach on her spring break in a bikini and she looks amazing, and you are not feeling so great that day, that, of course, can impact you. And so I think this is helpful to just have in mind, especially if you have a young person in your family or in your world that is entering social media, is just to be mindful of who they're following, what they're posting, and really checking in on how does it make you feel after you spend some time on social media. Are you feeling better about yourself or not, right? And then help to engage with them on potentially making changes around that as needed. I do want to say that we have seen that there's a corner of social media that's reflective more of the body positivity movement. It's showing pictures of diverse body shapes and sizes and is more focused on promoting positive body image. And there is research to show that that sort of content can actually be helpful in terms of body image if you are consuming body positivity content online. So I think that that is good to know that it is not all bad. And if we want to switch to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about this. I think social media's been around long enough that we all know it's based on an algorithm. And I do want to say social media in general isn't going to cause an eating disorder. Usually one thing in particular doesn't cause an eating disorder, but we do know, of course, that it can contribute. Some of the trends that we've noticed are not super helpful. All the filters that came out years ago, the it girl trend, what I eat in a day, outfit of the day, glow up content, right? And this is constantly changing and evolving. That some of that stuff is not super helpful. But again, if we can focus on changing your algorithm or the algorithm of the person that you love to try to see if you can get some diversity on there, if you can get some body positivity, if you can get content that isn't focused on bodies, that sometimes you can really use social media to your advantage. And also, like, we live in a little bit of a bubble here. And so social media has the potential to show us just so much more diversity in terms of shape and size and life experience. So I also want us to think about how to use it for good when we're exploring these topics. All right, now let's shift to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about some basic facts that I think are important to know if we're going to talk about eating disorders in particular. And so I want you to know that sometimes when I tell people that I work with eating disorders, they will tell me, especially on an airplane, right? They will tell me, oh, I really wish I had a little bit of an eating disorder. And I always tell them, you don't. Let me tell you, you do not. And the reality is, an eating disorder is not something that could be picked. It is not a choice that someone would decide to embark on an eating disorder in their life. It is a biologically influenced illness. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later, with a real genetic component to predisposition. Many people with eating disorders might look healthy. So judging somebody just based on their appearance would not necessarily tell you that somebody has an eating disorder. We usually have to look deeper and specifically look at vitals and blood work to really ascertain what's going on in someone's body. Eating disorders do not discriminate. They impact people of all genders, ages, races, body shapes, weights, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic status. So they occur across the board. They tend to occur around puberty. And recently, what we've noticed in the research is unfortunately that they are having an earlier age of onset, which is closer to around the age of 12 at this point, but they can develop at any age. So oftentimes, actually, when I will meet with clients, they will tell me that they remember having certain thoughts about food or their body really as young as 5 or 6 sometimes. So the seeds sometimes are planted much earlier. And oftentimes, too, I'll sometimes see people that maybe are in midlife and say that they had a journey in terms of their relationship with food and body, but a full-blown eating disorder maybe didn't develop until later in life. So I think that's helpful to know as well. Unfortunately, the mortality rate for eating disorders is among the highest of all mental health disorders. It actually used to be the highest. We just got surpassed by opioid use disorders. But about 6% of clients with eating disorders will die as a result of their eating disorders. Sometimes that death is not coded as an eating disorder per se, but it could be starvation, it could be cardiac arrest, or suicide associated with eating disorder symptoms. The good news in all of this is that full recovery from an eating disorder is absolutely possible. I believe that. I have seen it with my own eyes time and time again. And what we know is that if we can kind of intervene early and get in there as early as possible, those folks tend to do better. But really, we can intervene at any point, and we have a lot of research and data on what's helpful, and we can really help people move forward in their life. I do think it's important just to note, unfortunately, as we were preparing for this, we noticed that some folks were wondering, like, are they really still a thing? Are eating disorders and body image issues like really happening to the same degree? And unfortunately, what we've noticed is that the global prevalence rates have actually, in fact, doubled in the past decade. So from about 3.5% to about 7.8% is what we're noticing now in terms of prevalence rates of eating disorders overall. And about 40% of those cases are occurring within adolescents, ages 15 to 19. So that is the age group that we're looking at that it's most commonly occurring. So if we flip to the next slide here, we can take a little bit of a look at the big picture. I always used to joke, I used to work in a residential treatment facility, and we would get clients that needed 24 hours care. And I would always joke of like, on occasion, we might get someone that really only had an eating disorder, but that was actually quite rare. Oftentimes, eating disorders are occurring in a correlation or in a relationship with other co-occurring challenges. And so what you can see here is that if somebody might have a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa, there's an overlap there with autism spectrum disorder or the OCD spectrum. There's an overlap there with anxiety. Affective disorders or mood disorders are very likely to co-occur. So somebody that might have a diagnosis of an eating disorder may also have a diagnosis of depression or generalized anxiety disorder. We see an overlap with bipolar disorders and certainly ADHD and other addiction. So sometimes there's addiction in alcohol or other substances. So a lot of times, like there is just such an overlap. I think sometimes people think, though, they might say, well, if I recover from anorexia or from not eating enough, am I going to then switch to eat too much or to move into bulimia? And that is not the case. We do not see that necessarily happening, but there is sort of an overlap in some of these other conditions that I think are important to keep in mind. A couple things that are not on this slide that I think are helpful to know is that body dysmorphia, which we talked a little bit about in the beginning, which is sort of an obsession with certain parts of the body at times and feeling like there is a distortion around your perception that really is distracting to the point of interfering in daily functioning. So that is actually a legitimate diagnosis now in the DSM-5. Body dysmorphic disorder is actually coded in the OCD spectrum as overlapping with obsessive thoughts and an eating disorder. So we do see that in there as well. And then there's a couple that aren't necessarily full-blown diagnostic criteria, but I think that are helpful to know about, and that is orthorexia. Now, this came up several years ago, and I think is actually really culturally accepted quite a bit. Orthorexia is this idea of needing to eat really healthy foods. Foods, sometimes that goes into only wanting to eat organic foods, only wanting to eat maybe from certain vendors or certain farmers. But the obsession with that isn't necessarily about weight and shape. It's more about the quality of food. And sometimes it can kind of get into like a holier than thou perspective of really feeling better about themselves as a human because of the types of food that they are consuming or not consuming. And so orthorexia oftentimes could overlap with an anorexia presentation and can really be threatening. But it does start in that healthy food idea, which is sometimes glorified in our society these days. So it's just something to have an eye on. Compulsive exercise is also something that can happen within the context of an eating disorder. And if we look at that, sometimes we see in someone that's really addicted to exercise a similar model that we might see in someone that's addicted to another substance, in that they might need increasing amounts of exercise to feel okay. They might have symptoms of withdrawal if they try to reduce their exercise. So the exercise really can start to interfere in their daily functioning. And that's when we would call it compulsive. And then ARFID as well. ARFID is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And that we would see again on here, that would sort of be a little circle in between the autistic spectrum and the OCD spectrum. ARFID, again, is not based on an individual's concern with their weight or shape, but it is based on a concern with the type of food that they're eating. And sometimes it's more of a sensory presentation. Maybe they're only eating white foods, or they're only eating foods that are crunchy because softer foods bother them. And it gets to the point sometimes within ARFID that there is a malnutrition component just because of the limited nature of foods that are being consumed. So that is an official diagnosis in the DSM as well, but there's great treatments to be able to help folks through it. And ARFID we see oftentimes in younger kids. Sometimes that's we get confused. Is it ARFID? Is it just picky eating? And so there are ways to try to break that apart and make sure we can take care of someone that you might have some concerns about with that. The next thing I wanted you to just be aware of and to know of is this idea that eating disorders are biological, they're psychological, and they're social in nature. And sometimes when you see a model like this, we also talk about even like a spiritual component of it. So, eating disorders are biological illnesses that intensify vulnerabilities to developmental, interpersonal, and environmental factors, including the idealization of thinness. So sometimes in this model, it's called the genetic vulnerability model. What they'll say is that genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So if you have somebody that maybe there are eating disorders or other addictive type of disorders or OCD in the family history in terms of mental health. So you know genetically maybe there's a predisposition for somebody to have an eating disorder. And say there's a kid in the family, in that genetic family, and one kid chooses to go play ice hockey and the other kid chooses to want to be a high flyer in cheerleading, right? The environments and the social pressures that those two kids are putting themselves under because of the different choices they're making are really different. Sports in themselves can really be protective, we find at times, especially a sport like hockey, right? Where you're cold, you're wearing a lot of gear, you're on the ice, right? You're doing something like that with your body where your body isn't judged necessarily or part of how you're scored in terms of the sport. High flyers in cheerleading need to be light and small and easily thrown in the air, and they are judged based on their appearance and their body type, and that can bring up a whole other source of issues. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have eating disorders in your family that you can't be a cheerleader. It just means that you have to be sensitive to that and really be careful about how that individual is feeling and how those social pressures are impacting them, and maybe making sure we can have some other supports in place, that they have friends and family around them that have positive body image, that eat flexibly, so that we can support them in the choices that we're making. So if we flip to the next slide here, this is a slide from the organization, the Alliance for Eating Disorders. It's a great national organization that does research and provides some treatment connection and support. And so they have some ideas here of how would you know if you had an eating disorder? These are some symptoms that you might notice. So potentially refusal to eat around others, or oftentimes I'll hear of somebody making excuses around, oh, I already ate before, I'm going to eat later. And so they start eating less maybe at home with you, in the family, or around other people. Sometimes you might notice somebody engaging in really ritualistic eating habits, weighing their food, eating exactly the same thing every day, maybe having some physical symptoms, which might include weight gain or loss, hoarding or hiding food or stashing food away. Definitely an impact in terms of a decrease in self-esteem or body image. You might see excessive exercises in there. And then sometimes there's a scale on there of obsessing over physical characteristics, or even obsessively tracking weight or calories. There's a ton of apps that I think were intended to be helpful that I think a lot of people are using in an unhealthy way in terms of tracking weight and food eaten. So I think those are just some things to kind of think about and look at if you are worried about somebody you love. If we go to the next slide, I think this is important to keep in mind as we think about this too. Again, we said nobody chooses to have an eating issue or an eating disorder. It's oftentimes serving a real function for them. And so, oftentimes, when we look under the hood of an eating disorder, we're seeing some of these real issues at play. So, maybe it's a self esteem issue. Maybe it is some perfectionism that they're feeling. High achievement orientation is on there. We know we live in a bubble where achievement is important to us and to a lot of our kids and to our schools. And so if someone feels like they're failing as a student, but they can be really successful at perfecting the way that they eat or at achieving a certain weight that they feel like will be better for them, we can kick something off. Sometimes it's a desire to feel like they're in control when everything around them is feeling out of control. Certainly puberty is a time that that might happen, but maybe there's a change in the family system. Maybe you have moved, maybe there's a divorce happening, maybe they're getting ready to go to college. And so sometimes really focusing in on needing to be in control of food or body can come up. And I think it's important to be aware of these and to notice how the eating disorder then might be actually not just changing their weight or shape or what they're doing with food or their body, but also decreasing their anxiety. Oftentimes, clients with eating disorders will report a numbness in terms of not feeling highs or lows in terms of emotionality anymore. They've also done research that for folks that vomit or purge after eating or after binging, that dopamine gets released in their brain after purging. And so the idea being like, is this an attempt to sort of self medicate, right? To feel a little bit better. And for some reason, they figured out that purging or throwing up does that for them. And so I think it's important to understand that, to know that this is not something around just eat more or eat less or go on a diet and everything will be better. This is, we have to solve the underlying challenges and support them around that before we can really ask their relationship with food and body to stabilize. So I want to talk a little bit about weight now too. In general, I think this is really important to understand and be sensitive to, especially if you have littles that will be approaching puberty at some times. What I have seen over the years is just like a general intolerance towards puberty in our culture. And I want you to think about like how much weight do you think is appropriate for a kiddo to gain as they're hitting puberty? So again, 11, 12, 13, that age. Just call to mind what you think is average or what do you think we're sort of aiming for? My experience over the years is that generally families, parents, loved ones are thinking that it's far lower than what the reality is. What the reality is that we are anticipating 40 to 50 pounds for girls in terms of weight gain and a height gain of potentially 10 inches. And for boys, we're anticipating 50 to 60 pound and a height gain of potentially 12 inches. It's a good amount, guys. It's a good amount. We have to be sensitive to that. We have to make room for that. I think this is why people talk about maybe having some awkward years, right? Where we're not loving how we look, right? And how we can support body image in another way. Oftentimes, kids get a little bit wider before they get a little bit taller. And so, how can we just allow some room for that in our world, in our culture, and monitoring your own reactions to growth and weight changes, and really talking to your physician. The growth chart can be really helpful when we're thinking about that. I'm going to talk about that, I think, on the next slide. And then when we're talking about weight, if someone actually has an eating disorder, stabilizing weight is incredibly important and something that should really be prioritized if they're getting some help. In the field of eating disorders, we talk a little bit about what's called a metabolic tipping point. And that is a critical threshold of energy intake and weight, typically below which the eating disorder will kind of turn on. And we see this specifically in anorexia, that somebody might have a genetic predisposition for anorexia, but maybe they've been okay in their life. And for some reason, they decide to go on a spring break diet and they might lose weight, and sometimes it's like a switch gets turned on, right? If they sort of lose below a certain number, and it's different for every person, it's like it activates this eating disorder in their brain. And so for an individual, we're always trying to figure out what is a healthy weight range in which their body can turn that switch back off, and they can kind of be okay, and not have that activated within themselves. This is a quote from a recovered individual. Her name is Emily Boring, and she has a great article on the importance of getting and maintaining a healthy weight. She said that the single most important variable, the safeguard that separates the valley of recovery from the valley of illness, is maintaining the weight range that's right for me. Now, I just want to acknowledge, if you have a young person in your life, and they are struggling in their relationship with food, or they have an eating disorder, sometimes this is really tricky. When I have 12, 13, 14-year olds that I'm working with, and we're working on weight restoring them. So if they've been underweight or stabilizing their weight, we don't really know what their weight's supposed to be, right? If they've gotten sick in the context of adolescence, it's hard to know what weight should they be, how much food do they need, because they're still growing. And so how can you be tolerant of that and sensitive to that, so that we can make sure, if they're getting treatment, that they really get to a healthy weight so that they can sustain that. If they undercut it, if they don't quite get there, the eating disorder really stays active, and it's much, much harder for them to recover and move on. So it's a particularly tough time to get treatment and stay well, but it's really important. And then for those of us that are later in life, right, you might not have an eating disorder, but you might relate to this idea of like losing and gaining the same 5 to 10 pounds, right? So the idea of really understanding that we all have kind of a set point at which our body kind of wants to be at. We're going to talk a little bit about that more on the next slide too. But if we can accept that and just say, why am I gaining and losing the same 5 pounds? If my body wants to have those 5 pounds, just allow yourself to have the 5 pounds and move on, right? It will allow you so much more freedom, and it's better for your overall health than to be fighting that battle for years to come, whether you have an eating disorder or not. So just a little PSA with that. So how do we determine weight goals? Where do we think that set point is for every individual? Well, something that sort of we look at and that kind of helps us comes from a researcher, Dr. Sheldon, in the 1940s. He was doing research on body types. So he came up with this idea of the ectomorph, the mesomorph, and the endomorph. He was trying to study how these different body shapes and sizes might overlap or correlate with personality types. Now, that research didn't really stick as much as his idea of these body types. And the idea is that, like, you might within your family look at how you all look and realize, okay, yeah, we tend to be kind of ectomorphs. That's just like how my dad looks, how my grandfather looks. That's just sort of how our bodies are. And so sometimes it's sort of helpful just to look around you at the family genetics and say, all right, what am I working with here? Because that might influence how I want to take care of myself and my body, and maybe thinking about where my body might want to be. If we are trying to determine where somebody should be in terms of height and weight, we're also looking at their growth chart. And so you can talk to your pediatrician and just say, can we look at that growth chart again? Has my loved one fallen off of it? Are we not quite meeting it? Has there been a rapid increase? Typically, you want somebody to kind of stay on the average curve that they have been on from birth, really. And so that can really help us to decide too. And if you have somebody that's like shot up or shot down, that's definitely something to want to look at more closely and understand what might be happening there and what might be contributing to that change. Whenever I'm talking with somebody about weight too, I think that something that's helpful is to say, like, we're never going to go for wanting to be one weight. We're always looking at a little bit of a range. We all have flexibility always within our bodies and our weights within a few pounds. And so it's okay to say, rather than having a one number as a weight goal, we're just looking for like a healthy range that someone can get into. And then we're also always looking at heart rate, blood work, physicality, strength, general functioning. Those are just things that I think are always helpful to think of when we're determining weight and shape, is like looking at all those different variables. Okay, so then if we want to skip to the next slide, what's the plan? So if you're worried about someone, what do I do with all this information that you've given me now? You can skip to the next one now too. So if you're actually worried about someone, one thing that you can always do is just talk to them. I know I'm a therapist, and so I always encourage people just to have a conversation, but I really do think sitting someone down and saying, "Hey, I've noticed that you're not eating breakfast anymore. You're not eating dinner with us as a family anymore. I'm just noticing that your relationship with food and body has changed. Let's talk about what's going on. What might be contributing? How can I help?" If they do actually need professional help, we're always recommending a multidisciplinary team. So you want to get your physician involved. You want to get a therapist. It could be a PhD, an LCSW, an MFT, a licensed professional counselor. But ideally, you want them to have some experience in eating disorders or disordered eating. And then you're going to want a dietitian probably at some point too. If your kiddo is pretty young, you might talk to the dietitian separately, the therapist on your own to see what changes you might be able to make as a parent first, and then try to put some of those changes in place. Unless you have a young one that actually is open and willing to talk to a therapist. I find therapy goes best if your loved one actually wants to do it. And so I think that that can be a determining factor too in how you're asking for help. Some folks are in network, which means you can use your insurance. Some folks are going to be out of network. So that's a consideration to look at. And then there's different levels of care that you can consider. So outpatient therapy is maybe going to see a therapist once a week, once every other week, seeing that whole multidisciplinary team just in outpatient appointments. The next step up from that is intensive outpatient care. That's usually about 3 hours a day, somewhere between 3 and 5 days a week. Usually, somebody in an IOP is getting a meal and they're getting some group therapy and probably attending a program for that. The next up from that is partial hospitalization, where they're going for about 6 hours a day, usually 5 to 7 days a week. They're getting usually a meal or two and some snacks. They're getting therapy and medication management and groups and nutrition work. So they're getting a ton in a PHP. There are some PHPs in our area and IOPs as well. And then the next step up from that is residential. That's where you'd go if you need that 24-hour monitoring. There's usually 24-hour nursing. The average length of stay, I think these days in a residential program is probably somewhere between 30 and 40 days, although that depends on the individual and the nature of what is going on for them. And then the step up from that even is going to actually the hospital. And that you might go if there's an acute medical emergency or something that needs to be stabilized in terms of heart rate monitoring, medication change, something like that. Usually in this work, we're trying to start with the lowest level of care that is absolutely necessary and stepping up from there. And a lot of these you can get covered with your insurance. So I know it can sound overwhelming, but you can get some support to get this treatment if you need it. And then I wanted to just throw in here like how to respond to someone in a supportive way if you're worried. I think this 5-step model of emotion coaching from LaFrance and colleagues is a helpful one. So someone's coming to you initially, we're attending, right? We're paying attention to what they're saying. We're trying to kind of label it and name it for them. We're validating their experience. And then we're talking about how to meet the emotional need first. And then we're moving into problem solving. The quick and dirty method of this, the short form is like, first we're just validating and then we're providing support. And so I think this is always helpful to have in mind as a parent, is making sure that you're first just present and willing to listen and understand what's going on before we jump into trying to fix it or trying to set up all these appointments. And then let's talk quickly about some other things we can do. So if we're thinking about our relationship with food and how we can support positivity at home, I think an all foods fit or a foods flexibility model can be really helpful. I know that this kind of non-diet approach is not the norm in our culture. And so I just want to acknowledge that. But I think really talking about food as just being food, it doesn't have to be good or bad. Really trying to use mindfulness and maybe some intuitiveness to guide what you eat, which is sort of like what sounds good to us. what do you want to have today? Or if you're at a restaurant, what's jumping out at you that sounds good? And trying to eat with that. In this kind of approach, we're really trying to use fullness and hunger to guide us as well. And so sometimes checking in with your loved ones on like, how does your belly feel? Do you feel like you need more? Or do we feel like we're good? Making sure that kids know they can have more food later if they're hungry. It's not going anywhere. It's not like it's off limits. And I think that can give them freedom to really stop when they're full. Um, I use the guide a lot for folks of like eat every 3 to 4 hours, right? So having a breakfast, having a snack. Most people that I'm working with are having all 3 meals and usually 1 to 3 snacks or a dessert at some point during the day, and then more, right? More in terms of the quantity at those meals if they're an athlete, if they're super busy, if they're growing. I just went to a talk with a gastroenterologist recently, and I think that has become a whole world of how do you maximize your gut health. And unfortunately, sometimes in the wellness industry, I think that that can take a left turn. And it was really interesting because at the end of his talk, he was like, don't go crazy with this. Eat food, eat a variety of food, and like be mindful about the processed foods that you're integrating. But you don't have to eliminate things. Our gut likes variety. Like it's all okay. Let's just try to stay away from fads and from freaking people out about what they're eating. There's a great book that talks about this that's several years old now. It's called In Defense of Food, if you're interested in exploring this topic more. But I think just really thinking about variety, I think sometimes with little ones, you can talk about let's try to make sure we're eating some from the earth, which means we can eat vegetables from the ground or we can eat fish from the sea. And then we can also eat from packages or boxes, but we just want to find variety with that. Or sometimes we'll talk about, okay, we're going to try to make sure that we eat these foods that we know make us strong or that help our bones grow. And maybe sometimes we're eating foods just because they taste really good, and that's okay too, or because it's someone's birthday and the cake brings us all together. We are allowed to have that kind of variety. And so I really like this idea of helping loved ones in your family, creating a more positive approach to food. Um, for the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how we might contribute unknowingly to eating disorders and maybe unintentionally to eating disorders or body image concerns. So sometimes in our culture, in our world, we might praise somebody because of how they look, right? Oh my gosh, hey, you look great. Did you lose weight? Can sometimes happen. And maybe your little one hears that quite a bit. And so how do we shift that a little bit? I think as a parent, as a mom, it's really important to think about how you talk about your own body. If you are talking about yourself in a negative way, if you are constantly saying, oh, I feel so fat, right? How is that impacting those around you? And how can we shift that a little bit to be more neutral or be more positive? How can we shift away from talking about weight, diets, food being good or bad? Criticizing our eating or someone else's eating, and really making sure that we are staying away from attributing that being thin means that you're healthy, right? And again, just focusing on health and wellness beyond just size and shape, I think can be really helpful. So again, if we want to talk then for the next slide of like, okay, well, I have been contributing. I didn't realize that I was. What can I do that would be more helpful? Here's your tips and tricks. You are going to validate your loved one's experiences and feelings. It's not just about food and weight. I think sometimes that can look like if you're seeing someone you haven't seen in a while rather than commenting on that they've lost weight or they look great, right? Just saying, I'm so happy to see you, right? And validating them in a different way. Listening to your loved one's thoughts, feelings, and preferences. You can help them too. So if you have a loved one that's saying, Mom, I am not going to eat sugar anymore, and I want to be a vegetarian, and this is coming out of left field for you, you can try to dive deeper, listen to them. What are the actual concerns? And then I have in here, know better if you need to. If you know that for your loved one, cutting out sugar or saying, I'm going to be a vegetarian is way too restrictive and feels feels like it's going to result in something unhealthy, then you can say, we're not going to do that. Right. But let's talk about how we could be more mindful. Or let's talk about how I can support you better in terms of what food we have available for you at home and to make sure that you are still having enough variety. So you can support them in that way too. Modeling for yourself body acceptance and flexibility with food and exercise, practicing eating mindfully without distraction. So at home, maybe trying to have cell phones off the table, trying to have TVs off when you're eating, and really checking in on fullness and how the food tastes can be really nice. And then offering to get them support if they need support can, of course, always be helpful as well. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to just make sure you know there are some great books and resources out here. Intuitive Eating is a great book. You can get it on Amazon. They also have a workbook that's really helpful. Life Without Ed is a great written from a recovered individual. It's really digestible and an easy read for folks. Sick Enough is from a medical doctor who talks about all the different medical components and body systems that are impacted when you have an eating disorder. I think it's a really helpful one. Women, Food, and God is a Janine Roth one. It's just lovely. It's great to listen to as well, just about relationship with body and food. And then skills-based caring for a loved one with an eating disorder has a really nice way of thinking about how you can parent, different styles of parenting, and then how to move into maybe a more ideal way of supporting and influencing your loved ones. There's some great national eating disorder organizations as well on here. All of them have websites that have resources and support that can be helpful. Recovery Record on the bottom here actually has an app that is a helpful app that can help loved ones track how they're eating and associate that with mood in a more neutral and positive way versus sort of a dieting or a calorie counting app. So a lot of dietitians will use that in their work with clients. So that's a helpful one. And then lastly, here I have some podcasts for you on the next slide that are helpful. And there's so much more than this, but these are some ones that have been recommended to me or that I've listened to. The last person I want to list that was not actually on here is Zoe Bisbing, Bisbing. She has an Instagram, My Body Positive Home, and she posts really great advice on how to talk to kids and loved ones with really relevant questions about body image and things like that. So these are great resources that you can check out if you're wanting more information. And some of them you could even listen to with your loved one and maybe engage in a conversation with them about how it impacts them. And lastly, I just want all of us, let's trust our bodies, be kind to yourself. You are absolutely enough just as you are right now, and your joy matters. Please tell everyone you know. This is from the Nagasaki sisters and their burnout book in 2019. It was very popular. I think it's a great book and just a great, great quote for us. The fact that you jumped on here today to get this information just says that you care and you're trying to do the right thing. And I hope that this talk and information was helpful to you. So thanks for joining today. We
Thank
do
you.
have a little time left for some questions.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was excellent. Yeah, we do have a few questions. The first one is I have a child on ADHD meds that reduces their appetite. Instead of focusing on high value foods, they seem addicted to chips, candy, and Dr. Pepper. How can we get through? How do we manage that?
That is such a great question. And that is really fair. I think if you have someone on those meds, I mean, that is part of a side effect of them is that they will really reduce appetite. And so I do find that at times, my guess is that kind of an individual might not be eating very much at lunch, or maybe they're just eating those highly palatable foods at lunch. And then sometimes maybe even feeling kind of bingy at night or when they get home and the meds wear off. It could be something that you think about with your prescriber around, do you want to choose a longer acting medication or do you want to stagger when they're taking that medication just to see if you could get a really good breakfast in that day. Again, if we go by that model of let's try to eat every 3 to 4 hours, what I tell folks on this medication when they tell me like, I'm not hungry at lunch, I'm like, well, I don't really care if you're not hungry. We definitely need to have something at lunch. And so let's brainstorm together over what you can have that will actually keep your energy up. So maybe it's a protein shake, maybe it's just some other options. I might with them try to stay away from saying like you can't have the chips or the sodas or whatever it is, and just try to see if you can add in some variety other places. Like if you still want to have the chips and soda, okay, but maybe we also take some veggies and ranch dip, or maybe we also take some cheese and crackers so that you're getting a little bit more protein and you're getting a little bit more variety. Sometimes focusing on like variety is important rather than the food being good or bad can help somebody engage with you a little bit more. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, next question. When we see a friend of our child exhibiting signs of an eating disorder and have heard their parents are dismissing it, is there any point we
Mm.
raise with someone else?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. And that's really caring to be thinking of that in this way. Yeah, I think if you're really worried, I don't know, I would imagine trying to have a conversation with those parents directly. If it's like a kid situation, your kid is friends with the kid, maybe your kid could have a conversation with their friend and just say, I'm worried about you. Is there anything we can do? And maybe something would come of that conversation that you could bring to the parents. Unfortunately, there's probably not a whole lot you could do unless you guys are in a dance studio together and maybe you could go to the director and raise some concerns, or on a team together and you could go and raise some concerns and see if maybe you can get kind of someone else in that world to raise concerns. I can tell you it makes a tremendous difference to say something to the individual that is struggling, even if their response is minimal. You might not get them. They might not say anything in return. They might totally deny it and say, no, I'm totally fine. But what I can tell you time and time again is that I've had clients say, quite a few people came up to me and I totally denied it and said nothing was wrong, but it did impact me and it did make a difference. And those things added up over time and maybe empowered them to get help when they were more ready. So I try to think about it in that way of just acknowledging it and letting them know that there are resources, or here's some websites, or here's some podcasts. And if you need any more help, I'm happy to help. So yeah, I always trend towards have the conversation versus not.
Okay. I have a 14-year-old boy that does not eat breakfast, sometimes drinks juice and catches the bus.
Yeah, that is so not uncommon. Unfortunately, all my clients are like, oh my gosh, stop with the breakfast. I don't want to have breakfast. I will say there are some kiddos that tell me they wake up late. They just really are not hungry in the morning. I mean, you know your kid best. Like, does it seem like that is kind of who they've been, that they're really not hungry in the morning? If that's the case, you might be able to try again to do a bigger shake, maybe something that you're making for them with some protein powder or something like that in the morning, or something that they could take on the bus and still eat, trying to partner with them on like, we've got to do a little bit more in the morning. What do you think you could do? But if they're really not a morning person eater, maybe it's like that you're loading a morning snack or that lunch, afternoon snack, dinner a little more heavily. I think there's ways to kind of get their needs met and meet them where they're at if they're not a morning person. So I try to partner with them and see where else you could get some of those food needs met. And that's where you can bring a dietitian in as well. Sometimes they just have great ideas, or they can partner with them to say, okay, you're not hungry for this, but what if we tried this instead, right? Just to see if we can generally get them having a little bit more, especially for a 14-year-old boy, they need so much. So really trying to lean into it and see how you could get him to have a little bit more wherever in the day he wants it.
Okay. We have a few more questions, but we're running out of time. So, um, here's another one. My daughter tends to read, and I noticed she would eat more food. Should I stop her from reading while eating?
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah, I mean, I think you could have that conversation with her of why don't we just try an experiment, right? Like sometimes if you're going to have a snack, let's put the book down and have the snack and see how that impacts you to try to really eat it mindfully versus if, when you're reading, just because we tend to pay less attention when we're distracted. And the trick with snacks that I think are important is making sure that you're portioning them, right? Or that you're having your kiddo portion them. So if they're going to have cheese and crackers, right, you're putting it on a plate so that they have an appropriate portion and they can eat from that. I think that can really help versus just like eating directly from a bag or something like that. So I think you could also try that piece too. Um, I see here
Oh, yeah.
there's another question. The name of the Instagram account, Zoe. I can spell, yeah, her last name is Bisbing. So it's Bisbig. And the account is called My Body Positive Home.
Okay. Okay. So, well, I think we have time for one more question. Is that
Sure.
okay? My husband at the dinner table will start talking about how too much sugar can give you diabetes. We should cut down on juice, um, or not buy juice, or talk about putting mayo on the vegetables and how it's affecting high cholesterol. How do you
Yeah.
manage that?
That's such a good question, and that does unfortunately happen sometimes. So I think I would probably try to pull your husband and talk to him separately. You can say you came to this talk and just wanted to be more mindful about how you guys talk about food at the table with your family. I mean, I think that that's where that book, In Defense of Food, is really helpful because I think when we try to isolate one thing as the source of everything, that is really impossible for us to do for foods. I mean, foods have been pulled out and kind of bastardized for us over the years. And when we actually look at the research, it's like too hard for us to do that. I remember as a kid, right? They were like, oh my gosh, nobody should ever eat eggs. Eggs are terrible for you. Right. And so I remember as a kid, my parents were like, well, we're not going to have scrambled eggs anymore. Evidently, they're really bad for you. And then they were like, oh my gosh, never mind. Eggs are great for you. Everybody should have eating eggs all the right. And so that happens always in nutrition. And so, really talking to your husband about, again, flexibility, variety, I think as human beings, if you tell someone you are not allowed to have sugar, we are going to cut out all sugar. For some of us, that only makes us want it more. And so, having those discussions around good and bad foods and eliminating categories of foods completely is not something we want to do, right? We can say we want to be more mindful about how much sugar we're having as a family, but in general, just making sure we have flexibility and variety is the best thing that we know of right now. I think as long as you were having juice within reason and your kids seem to like have a normal amount of it and they're not binging on it or overeating it, it seems like it's all within reason. I think that's totally fine. And maybe that's where you could also say, I want to consult with a dietitian, right? That could help guide us as a family so that we feel like we can do things that feel good for all of us overall without kind of making up our own wellness advice, if that helps.
Oh, oh, I love that. That's a great point. Just so you know, when in doubt, bring in somebody who has that skill set that can have that conversation, just like you today. So I definitely learned a lot. It's been a while since I've heard a lot of, learned some new terms and also the resources, so many. So this was excellent. I did want to just share with everyone, there is a feedback survey if you want, there's a QR code there. Also, to let you know, is it next week? I guess it's already March 11th next week. So March 11th, there is a talk at the high school, and it's about the speaker, Dr. Geisler, is excellent, and he will talk about getting ready, the mental health of getting ready for kids going to college, and also what's happening in college. For kids and mental health. So he's excellent. And then also, our home tour is May 15th. So we encourage you to get involved, either volunteer or, look out for tickets to support CARES. So we hope you enjoyed this, and thank you, Dr. Coffin. This was excellent.
Of course, and I'm just noticing if I didn't get to you, please email me. I am happy to answer the questions I didn't get to directly. So please reach out, and I'm happy to get to those. So thanks.
Great. Exactly. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you all.